This may not be Apple's best MacBook, but for about the price of a nice pair of headphones, this is going to be that first MacBook for a lot of people. It's also the first to prove that it is possible to make a really affordable laptop which doesn't suck. The Neo, however, happens to be a really difficult MacBook for me to review because this being the entry-level model means every other MacBook in the current lineup is objectively a better MacBook, and those have been around long before the Neo. So I am acknowledging there is a bias if the Neo isn't your first MacBook. I do still find this very impressive, but don't expect it to blow your socks off. So viewer advisory, if you are indeed looking to get the Neo as your first MacBook, sorry for the lack of sugarcoating, but I will not be pretending that MacBook Pros don't exist for the next few minutes. That being said, on the other end of the stick, even if you daily some of the best Macs in existence, what you will find with the Neo is it can absolutely still give you that unmistakably polished, fluid macOS experience you're so used to. And I think that's where the Neo is truly impressive. This is as entry-level as MacBooks get, and the bar has been set truly high for what is objectively the minimum Mac experience. Take for example how the build quality from the enclosure, the hinge to the keyboard feels exactly like what you'd get from the MacBook Airs and Pros. You even get that thing where the color of your macOS interface is matched to the color of your MacBook Neo out of the box. And this starts all the way from the activation screen, because if you look in settings, it defaults to a color called This Mac, and it's unique to the color of MacBook Neo you've chosen. I believe the only other Macs which get this treatment are the 24-inch iMacs. Interestingly, this is not a thing if you get the classic silver version. And if you want to talk about how seriously Apple takes to color matching their hardware, the keyboards are tinted, the first on any MacBook, the USB ports match, the inside of the headphone jack matches, and even the feet on the bottom match. Colors aside though, the Neo's hardware does really feel like a slightly smaller and very slightly thicker MacBook Air. The corner edges on the top side are also noticeably more rounded than the ones on the MacBook Air and Pro, but a less subtle indicator of a MacBook's identity is the finish of the Apple logo. We all know on the Pros it's a glossy black, and on the Airs it's a mirror finish. On the Neos, it's a matte finish. I will say this. The low price of the MacBook Neo isn't a miracle. What it is very clever and carefully curated cost cutting. It's the art of cheapening the price without making the product tacky. Little things like foregoing MagSafe 2 for charging and not having the keyboard being a backlit one. If it makes it any easier to swallow, the $200 Magic Keyboard I use with my Mac Studio isn't backlit either. Only one of the 2 USB ports is USB 3 compatible. Now this I do find a bit annoying because there's no easy way of remembering which one's which, and the trackpad now uses a fully mechanical click instead of a force touch trackpad, which is again something to get used to if you're coming from any other MacBook. I still accidentally mash my finger down at a file trying to rename it, but credit where it's due, it still clicks very evenly from corner to corner and it still supports multi-touch and gestures. And then there are also 2 more features which are not on the MacBook Neo. These definitely contribute to cost savings, but I dare say the majority of users would never even notice these features are not here on the Neo. The display is sRGB, so it doesn't cover P3 like the rest of the current MacBooks, and the headphone jack isn't a one that supports high impedance headphones like the rest of the current MacBooks. That would be a lovely feature to have, no doubt, but I think most people who have that headphone jack feature have never stuck a high impedance headphone into that jack. So a lot of the Neo is about not paying for things you won't use. That's how you end up with a perfectly good MacBook for 3/4 the price of this memory card. With sheer pricing alone, this has stolen the title of most affordable Mac from the Mac Mini. But I also want to point out that this is a MacBook outvaluing the desktop Mac Mini. That means not only does this cost less money, but the cheapest Mac now comes with a display, a keyboard, a trackpad, its own power, as well as speakers. Speaking of speakers, that's a really weird line. The dual side firing speakers on the Neo I do think these sound better than the 13-inch MacBook Air's speakers, audibly more detail in the lower frequencies, and they still support spatial audio. But all that out of the way, what I was truly curious about is performance. How far can you take a MacBook running the A18 Pro? It's impressive enough that this is a whole MacBook running macOS comfortably on a chip which was designed for this. Yes, it was the most powerful chip ever in a smartphone, and it shows just how much headroom these things have when we're running things on it far exceeding what would be done on a phone. But reality is, depending on what your intentions are, an A18 Pro may or may not be enough. Broadly speaking, there's 3 zones you might find yourself in when it comes to MacBook Neo sufficiency. The first category would be things the Neo can easily handle. Unsurprisingly, that includes word processing, spreadsheets, presentations, or anything web-based. And I think that really should be a baseline. Designing graphics in Pixelmator Pro or Canva, no issues there. Even Photoshop runs with relative ease on the Neo. And then we've got things which you could get done on a Neo, but there's certainly room for improvement if you, say, opted for a more powerful Mac. Here we're talking about editing large catalogs in Lightroom, as well as light to moderate video editing work in something like Final Cut Pro. Surprisingly, the Neo was quite workable when I tried editing 4K footage on it. Nothing too crazy, just basic color adjustments, applying LUTs, couple of transforms, transitions, audio mixing. It wasn't the absolute most responsive experience I've had, but definitely enough to get work done and delivered. Then finally, the category of things I don't recommend getting a MacBook Neo for. If you're trying to, say, run local LLMs, then you should be looking at something with more RAM. If you're trying to run AAA games like Cyberpunk, the Neo will run it, but it does struggle and is not exactly a recommendable experience. If you intend to do heavy compositing or VFX work in something like After Effects, that requires a lot of RAM. Or you're trying to apply noise reduction to clips in real time, which requires a lot of GPU resources, that's all asking a lot from the Neo. I was also trying to gauge how the Neo's performance sits in comparison to something like an older generation M2 MacBook Air. If we look at Geekbench 6 scores, the M2 still holds an edge when it comes to GPU and multi-core GPU, but the Neo has a single core score that's more like what you'd get with an M3. Again, crazy to think that this was originally an iPhone chip. So if you are indeed considering this as a first Mac, the Neo genuinely has a lot to offer. I know it may appear relatively lean considering how insanely powerful Macs can get, but even at a minimum, the Mac experience has not been compromised at all when it comes to the Neo. If this is your first Mac, you're gonna be in love with all the features which come standard with any Mac, like universal clipboard, handoff, AirDrop of course, iPhone mirroring, push-through, the fact that pages, numbers, keynotes are always included and are totally free. Also, you do get Touch ID with the 512GB version, but if you're getting the base 256 version, which has a lock button instead of Touch ID, you can make use of a neat macOS feature, which unlocks your Mac using your Apple Watch instead. So yes, this may be Apple's entry-level MacBook, but in a price range where laptops are expected to be straight up bad, you can say the MacBook Neo is doing quite a bit better than not bad.